Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to share that this podcast discusses themes around domestic violence, suicide, self-harm, and mental health. We want to ensure that everyone listening feels safe and supported, so please do listen with care. If this episode might be too heavy for you, feel free to skip and join us in our next episode. If you or a loved one are in need of support, remember help is always available. Contact Lifeline on 13 11 14.
Getting my first diagnosis of depression and anxiety was honestly really difficult. I hated it.
Mental health is now one of the most common reasons.
It's a worry. These problems are escalating.
Regional parts of the country are struggling with the issue.
We haven't fully addressed the scale and the complexity of these problems.
In this episode of the Level Asian podcast, we're chatting to Emily Unity, an award-winning mental health advocate, software engineer, and creative designer.
I really didn't have a sense of who I was growing up. I was struggling with mental health for a very long time when I was very young. My parents, had struggled through so many different things, whether it be war or migration. Mental health was thought of as like a luxury or like a nice to have, or it didn't even exist in the languages that they came from.
Asian parents, a lot of the time, especially migrant parents, they go through a lot of stuff, and in their worlds of survival, mental health is probably the last thing that they would even think of.
Me going on a mental health journey, but very much like dragging my parents unwillingly with me. We had these like huge family sessions where we were unpacking all this stuff, and it was so hard for them. It took them a very long time to open up, but when they did, it was really meaningful for me and really healing for me. One of the biggest wins with my parents was when my mum started seeing the same psychologist as me.
Wow.
Everyone has mental health. Not everyone has mental health challenges, and everyone has different types of privilege, whether that be race, whether that be ability or education or employment. Just learning about yourself and checking yourself about your privilege, be able to see like where you're privileged in and where you're also oppressed in. That's so powerful, and be able to understand like, hey, this is actually, I'm really aware of everything that I have going on to me, because most people, they're not aware of it because they're just given it and they think everyone else is going through the same.
Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode.
Welcome to the Level Asian podcast, Emily. How are we feeling today?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm anxious, but like a normal amount of anxious for me.
Okay.
I'm super excited to be here, honestly. And I don't know, like this is a topic that's really close to my heart, and it's really lovely to be around peers.
Definitely. Just off camera before, we were talking about how 25 under 25 and 30 under 30. That's really exciting. Congratulations as well.
Thanks.
You're quite young. We were actually talking about that off camera as well. And I was like a little bit shocked about, I just assumed, 30 under 30, maybe you were closer to 30s, but you're 26 and you've achieved a lot so far, like incredible amounts. So maybe just to dive into it as well, can you tell us a little bit about 25 under 25 and 30 under 30? What's that like? What was the process like? And how did you feel when it got announced?
Honestly, those type of awards, I'm still like, I have like huge imposter syndrome. I think many of us do. But those type of awards, I still like don't quite register them in my head. And there's many like, I don't know who nominated me for any of them. I'm still trying to track them down. I like go and bother my friends like, did you submit it? But 25 under 25 was pretty wild. That was hosted by a colleague of mine that did Future Generations and Future Next. And like, it's honestly like so exciting to be listed like among peers. I think that like those type of lists, like the 30 under 30 was for queer folks as well. I just love like connecting with community and connecting with people that are like-minded. And I think that that's like a very like small subside of like being on those lists, is that you get to see other people that are in those types of spaces and advocating for whatever they're passionate about.
So then tell us a little bit about what you advocate for and why you got nominated.
I do mental health sort of advocacy, but particularly from a diversity and inclusion lens. I sort of started advocating out of necessity, I think, not out of a direct choice. It definitely, the work that I do these days, I didn't know existed when I was younger. I was struggling with mental health for a very long time when I was very young, but I didn't know that mental health was really a thing, particularly within the culture that I grew up in. My parents, they, had struggled through so many different things, whether it be war or migration, and mental health was thought of as like a luxury or like a nice to have, or it didn't even exist in the languages that they came from. And so for me, like I was struggling with all these things that I couldn't express and they couldn't understand. And when it kind of hit a crisis point and I ended up in like hospitals or breaking down at school or in public places, it was at a point where I realized that I really do need this help. And I was kind of funneled into different spaces, and I finally did find the support that I needed. And I realized that I do deserve that support and that it's okay to talk about these feelings and these emotions. And I realized that like speaking up about our experiences, it kind of gives that permission for other people to speak up as well. I think that was one of the wildest things, particularly growing up in Australia, is that we see all these mental health campaigns about like, are you okay day? It's okay to not be okay. But then there are very few people that look like us that are actually speaking up and sharing our experiences. So that's kind of what I started doing when I was very young, around age 12, and just continued that. And now I work in like mental health advocacy spaces that I do this for a full-time job. So I kind of like build platforms to help other people share their stories and raise awareness and embed them to policy or service design and make sure that, you know, services and supports are actually good for us diverse folks, and that mental health looks completely different depending on who you're talking to.
100%. I really enjoyed what you shared just then, because as Asian Australians, mental health, I feel like for me personally, hasn't really become a discussion until recently. And that's because other people are starting to talk about it. And so we're all starting to become more comfortable talking about it, right? Yeah. We're going to dive more into that, but just to wind it back a little bit, because we like to ask this with all of our guests. Tell me a little bit more about your upbringing in childhood. You alluded to it a little bit, but maybe just trace it back a little bit and then give us a bit more context about how it was like growing up.
Of course. Please do stop me and ask more questions or like tell me if I'm going too deep.
Yeah, all good.
So I'm very open about my story. So I will flag some trigger warnings before I get into it. So when I was younger, I grew up in Perth in Western Australia. I grew up incredibly privileged. I went to this wonderful school with all these people that just had like everything given to them. And I felt like I had everything given to me as well. I always felt like I never had a reason to complain. And I was taught to be really grateful for everything that I had, whether it be like food or education or housing. My mum and dad, I knew, came over to Australia when they were both really young. My dad's Malaysian, my mum's Vietnamese. They both had struggled with different things in their childhood. And I felt like they didn't get a childhood really. And that I was kind of like, they were trying to live vicariously through me. And I was trying to give like them everything that they didn't have. I really didn't have a sense of who I was growing up. I think like I was just really good at what I now call masking. I'd go into different situations and put on different masks. So if I was at home, I'd be like the very quiet, studious person. If I was in school, I'd be the very like social person, playing sport, playing music, like different sort of situations required me to wear different masks. And I just kind of adapt to being whoever the people around me wanted me to be in that exact moment. And so because of that, I had like zero sense of who I actually was and zero sense of who I was behind closed doors or just in quiet times by myself. That sort of stuff, I think, really manifested a lot later on in lots of identity sort of crises, lots of things that I now know are like depression and anxiety, but I was just struggling with these really heavy, deep feelings of feeling like I wasn't good enough for anyone, regardless of whatever situation I stepped into. For my family, I think it was really hard for them to express emotions in a way that was really healthy for me. And they saw me going down different paths or doing different things that they thought was harmful or bad for me. And so by trying to guide me on the right path, the way they expressed that wasn't the best for me. So I did grow up in a quite violent household that I didn't realize was violent at the time. I thought it was very normal. I thought everyone else was experiencing that. And when it did hit that crisis point around age 12, I had this big breakdown at school that was after like this very difficult point of I'd experienced bits of homelessness where I was running away from home and staying under park benches because it was safer to stay outside rather than go back home. But I thought that was normal. And there were bits where, you know, I would have like scars sometimes on my body and I would need to like hide them under like really warm clothes, like jumpers. And a clinician picked up that at school and I was sent offsite to like a private psychologist who started talking about these things I had no idea about. Mental health, like all these sorts of terms, and talking about my feelings was so foreign to me. And that started the journey of like me going on a mental health journey, but very much like dragging my parents unwillingly with me. They had no idea about any of it. We had these like huge family sessions where we were unpacking all this stuff, and it was so hard for them to really acknowledge that they also had feelings and struggles and that they deserve support too. And I think, you know, for the first at least like year or so, they did that sort of front-facing mask of like everything's fine, because there's always like this stigma coming from people outside of you. And it took them a very long time to open up, but when they did, it was really meaningful for me and really healing for me. And so my mental health journey is like completely inseparable from their journey as well. And as I've become more comfortable with who I am, how I feel, I've been able to explore different parts of myself as well. So whether that be like my sexuality or my gender, or whether it be also discovering that I'm autistic and disabled. There's just like so many bits that I was pretending for so long that I didn't realize that there were supports out there that I actually deserved and that I could access and were available. And it's been so meaningful to just be who I am and be authentically me, and now step into spaces that I can see other people celebrating who they are and seeing diversity as something that's a real strength, not something to hide away from.
Again, thank you for sharing that. A lot of it is like, it's hard for some people to share, right? And the fact that you are quite open about it gives other people almost permission, or opens the door for them as well to share their experiences and be okay with how they're feeling. Because unless you hear it from someone else, you might not know what those feelings might be, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't have the language to talk about anything that I was really feeling until I saw like other people speaking up about it. I think it's, you know, partially permission giving, but there's still like these days where someone will say something, I'm like, yes, that's that feeling. Because I have like lots of like these foggy feelings or these images or colors in my head, and I don't know how to translate it into a way that really lands with other people. I think like one of the most powerful things is not just giving permission to talk about something, but then also like giving them like the different tools to express themselves. So like whether it be artistically through like art or through like music or through written words. I just love like people actually speaking their truth and sharing their stories.
Yeah, 100%. I can resonate a lot with your story already, to be honest. And just the way that you've talked about emotions and how, you know, self-identity as well, and the deep feelings of, you know, how to express these emotions too. Just also curiosity. I know we've spoken about on the prep call, your interest in music and being creative as well, and arts, etc. Before we get into that though, I do want to ask about how schooling went. Otherwise, I know you spoke about just then the journey of seeing an offsite therapist as well, and then also being at a privileged school. But were you able to finish high school, and then did you go to university after that?
Whilst I did like start volunteering and do advocacy within mental health at age 12, it was like super secret and super like spy-like. Everything on the outside, apart from like the one like crisis moment when I was 12, was like I was still kind of pretending to be the golden child, still getting, you know, all the straight A's at school. I even had like the bob and the glasses. Like I was like, yeah, you're a very standard dictionary textbook kid. And I think going to uni, I just did it because it was what was expected of me. I ended up becoming a software engineer. I did love that. I do love coding. It's very satisfying, and it makes a lot of sense compared to a lot of the emotions that I feel. But it was very like what was expected of me, not necessarily something that I really wanted to do. And I think that was really hard for a lot of people in my life to kind of reconcile when I became a lot more public about my advocacy, a lot more public about the journey that I went on. Because on the outside, they saw like this very stereotypical Asian, like young first daughter, go through uni, get the like standard job, work at like one of the like big mining firms, and then suddenly drop all that. And I've done all this other stuff in the background. It's still odd to kind of balance myself within those two spheres. And I think I'm coming to like a really nice middle point where I'm able to do like all that tech stuff and use all that knowledge and those skills that I built along the way, but then also be authentically who I am as well in these spaces.
Yeah, 100%. So then can I ask where along the timeline, maybe giving some dates and ages, did the mental health advocacy kind of come in? I know that you kind of spoke about when you were younger, you started speaking about it, and then it maybe became more of a paid gig and then more of a full-time thing now that what you're doing. But how does that happen, and where did it happen?
It's so hard to track. I'd say like I definitely just purely did volunteering when I was a lot younger. And then every now and then, like a random gig would be like, oh yeah, we'll reimburse you for this. Or like it was like an honorarium, so you get a gift card afterwards. And then there was just more and more gigs that were like that. And then as you're kind of being more public about your story and people identify with you and then say like, oh, hey, I actually want you specifically for this event, they start offering payment up front. And it just kind of transitioned to something that I realized like, oh, I can actually make a living off of this and that I don't need to keep up this job that everyone expects me to do. It just became like more and more viable. I'd say like my first full-time like identified mental health role was when I was, I think 20. And that was something that was super scary because I was definitely like, that was an active choice leaving the main roles that I had traditionally had and stepping into spaces that were a lot more identified within this space. So I think that was like the main switching point, but it was much more like, it just happened. And I think that happens for a lot of people of like being more comfortable with who you are. It's not necessarily a very like straight trajectory. It's just kind of like bumping into walls, finding your way, and it's very like wiggly and up and down. I definitely had like moments of uncertainty and regret and not being sure about whether this is like the right thing for me, but ultimately I'm so sure that it really is, and I'm really glad that I got through those periods of like not knowing what was happening.
For sure. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of speaking gigs you had or different gigs you had as well?
Yeah, sure. So when I was younger, a lot of my advocacy looked like me going out, writing a speech with an organization. The organization would need me to like speak at, say, like a corporate well-being event or a fundraising event, and be very like specific as to what it would look like. And I had like a 2-minute speech or a 5-minute speech or a 10-minute speech that they had written with me and prepared. And I'd go up, I'd share that as part of a meeting or a proceeding, and then that would be it. It was very like standard and routine. As I started getting more into like advocacy spaces that were not like that, it started to be a lot more freeform, and I started to have a lot more autonomy as to like what I wanted to say. I also started to be less like grateful for the opportunities that were presented.
Interesting.
And more like realizing like, hey, I can actually push beyond this. Because I think the first time that someone asks you to tell your story, you're like, oh my gosh, like thank you so much for listening.
I see, yeah.
And then now it's kind of like, hey, actually, I want to share this in my own words, like aside from the script, or aside from whatever like bit that you want to like fit me into like your puzzle. Yeah. So like building my own kind of like platforms or like going to policy submissions and stuff like that, where you get to be entirely in charge of whatever you say. That was really powerful. So I think that was the kind of like next step, but that did take a while. And then it went more into like gathering other people's voices. Cause I think one of the things that I've always been really passionate about is that my experience I know is unique and important, but it's so different to other people's experience, so different, like everyone's experience is so important and so unique. And so I wanted to provide these kind of safe spaces that I had benefited from, but for others. So it became more of like platform building, community building for other people to share their voices and advocate in ways that were really meaningful for them. So that's the bulk of what I do now these days. So kind of like me bringing people together as opposed to me just like saying a scripted story is what it began with.
Yeah. I guess for those who might not be familiar, myself included, what kind of organizations are you working with? And you've mentioned policy changes as well. What does that look like in terms of impact, and where does it go? Like, is it involved with the government, for example, or different organizations within the Australian government? How does it go beyond just working with people? I know you describe it very nonchalant, but if we were to give some concrete guidelines of what that might look like.
I will give you like 5 examples of kind of projects that I'm working on at the moment. So the first one is my main role at the Royal Children's Hospital. So there I established the lived and living experience engagement strategy. And lived and living experience is kind of the term that we use to describe our own experiences of mental health. It's different to like what a clinician would kind of observe as someone else's experience or research. So it's us speaking for ourselves. So I established a strategy that ended up building a network. So I coordinated a network of about 1,500 people from across Victoria, and they share their experiences with me, and I bed it into like service design or delivery. That can look like advisor committees, or it can look like bits of workshops or co-design. And it's honestly like so wonderful, particularly within the children's mental health space.
Yeah, wow.
And when we're talking about like preventing things early or addressing things early, I think children's where we need to start. So that's wonderful. And like, I really enjoy that job. Another example is I worked with Meta, so Facebook and Instagram, to build kind of like a youth consultation about the metaverse. So like VR and so virtual reality and augmented reality, and making sure that young people's voices are really heard in the development of that. Because I think a lot of us were just kind of subjected to social media and technology. And there have been a lot of positives that come out of that, but a lot of negatives as well. So proactively addressing that in the next stage of tech is really exciting. So that's something else. There's also a lot of like going to Parliament quite often, speaking to politicians and making sure that we hold them accountable to different things. I realize that there's a kind of methodology to that. I often get sent to Parliament because of one of the orgs that I'm volunteering with, whether it be like UNICEF or like the Consumers Health Forum. You often get to meet with like the health minister and you get like 2 minutes to make sure that they hear what you want to say, but it's about guaranteeing that action afterwards. So often it's a lot of like, hey, you promised to do this with me, who do I follow up with afterwards? So a lot of that was like a lot of skill building for me to actually learn how to engage with politicians. And then the last little bit I think is really about like more creative sort of ways of engaging with people. The fourth bit is about engaging with people in a creative way. And that's a lot of like art therapy, running art workshops. At the moment, I'm working with a group of young people over in Western Sydney, and it's so wonderful over in Bankstown. Like everything's in language over there. It's so multicultural. It's beautiful, but often like there's such a stigma within multicultural communities to talk about mental health. And so we provided them a space for them to share their stories, and now we're creating artworks that are based on their like shared experiences. And those artworks will kind of serve as like the conversation starter for other people. And then I think like the fifth example is kind of one-to-one peer engagement. So do a lot of like it's called lived experience supervision, but what it really is kind of just mentoring. Because I think there's a lot of people in this type of space that they see like, say I publish an article in like a newspaper, and there's very little understanding of like how to get from, hey, I experienced this, to like, how do you get to like publishing the article, or how do you get to Parliament, or building this sort of stuff. And I think those mentoring relationships are so important, and I've definitely benefited from so much of that before. But it's very like personable, and building those kind of relationships to make sure that we each have each other's back. Because I think this advocacy movement, it's not like one person leading it. It's like us all having each other's back in like the same line and working alongside each other, which is so beautiful. And I think really grounds me in this work.
Wow. That's so many different facets, but also I think it covers a lot, because what people might often forget is different people can communicate through different ways, and they need resources through different avenues, because the brain works so differently for different people. I personally, like through my mental health experience growing up, I don't think I've shared this with anyone before, but going through it, I won't go into too much detail, but going through therapists, seeing psychologists, having that layered on top with the nuances of being a Chinese Australian or Asian Australian, also growing up in a rural area of Australia, that altogether is like, one, you don't understand the nuances, you don't feel seen and heard, your parents are pushing against it, they're trying to put on a brave face and everything is okay. And then also the resources of like, you just see a counsellor and that's it, once a week, once a fortnight, that kind of thing, right? And then where else are you supposed to go from there? And then trying to understand your identity and what all these words mean, anxiety, depression, self-harm. Like, what are you supposed to do with that as a kid? So all of this work that you're doing is incredible, and I think the impact of it is so insane. And doing it now has its ripple effects later on and long term. Do you feel the sense of like, yes, all of this work I'm doing is going to have a big impact, or is it just something you're passionate about? Can you touch on a bit of that and how you feel?
Firstly, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Honestly, like it's really, really beautiful. And there's so many like layers and barriers that you would have faced, like getting help. And I think that sort of stuff, like you sharing that, it's not something that people can really read in a book or really understand. You have to have that conversation with you. So thank you for sharing that. Of course. I think like stuff like that. So just an example of when I share my story, when I see other people share their stories, it's kind of like this weird healing of the heart that I don't know, it creates that connection that I think gives people the permission to actually go and seek help themselves or create a change. And I think so many of us, like we're just stuck in these systems and these ways of thinking that we just accept or just try to move on, or just try to survive in many of these types of things. And I think that that's very true for a lot of like migrant Asians or like second generation migrants as well, that we're just surviving. And I think we don't really stop and think like, how can this be different? And can we actually change the system? So I think that the work that I do these days, it's out of a passion, definitely, and kind of like ethical responsibility. I think I've just seen so much and connected with so many people that I know that there's so much that needs to change. And I feel privileged to be able to speak English and to be able to be able-bodied and present in these spaces. So there is that part of like responsibility, but I also love this work. I can't tell you like how meaningful it is to be able to have these conversations like you just shared with me. It really like, it hits home every time for me. So whenever it be like, I'm in an advisory committee and someone shares like a tiny bit like that, or like later today I'm going to like a panel and I've supported people to go and present on the panel, them like seeing them shine and seeing people actually like step up and share their experiences in a tiny little way or whatever is comfortable for them. It gives me a sense of hope and optimism. It's so healing for me. I think a lot of people think that I'm like this entirely selfless person, and it's not like that. I think like this work is very reciprocal. When you see other people healing, it's also like healing for you to witness as well. So I'm actually, I don't know, a big part of this is like really positive for me. It's a big part of my recovery journey. I think if I couldn't do this work, it would be so sad.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, I don't know. There's so many reasons why I do it. It's so incredibly, I don't know. It's my main reason for being and living and making meaning out of everything that I do. I can't imagine my life without it.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I don't know. I feel really touched by that.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show.
To get into like the more detailed nuances of your story, and if you're comfortable sharing, would you be able to take us into what your mental health journey looks like to help shape what you're doing today? So, you know, the stuff that you touched on from your childhood before, and then also going through getting diagnosed for autism or ADHD and depression and anxiety. Because I don't know, from my experience, I'm kind of looking into how Asian females or just females in general, a lot more people are getting diagnosed with ADHD or realizing they have autism.
Yep.
And just having that diagnosis in itself just clicks something in your mind that makes it feel like, I'm okay. There's an answer for this. Finally, I have an answer to why I've been feeling maybe so crazy or so angsty all the time. So maybe if you could go through that journey, how you got diagnosed, just so people can see a lens of what that might look like.
So chronologically, I'll delve into it like real in detail, but it was like depression, anxiety first, and then it came like eating disorders, and like around that time was also realizing that like things like domestic violence, which is not a diagnosis, but I realized there were words for it, and homelessness as well, and then later ADHD, and then autism. So I'll speak in that order.
Yeah.
Getting my first diagnosis of depression, anxiety was honestly really difficult. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I felt like I had been labeled with something that was permanent. And I thought like, okay, I'm not Emily anymore. I am depressed person. And like, I thought like this was just something that I was like a defining feature of who I was, and was something that was completely inescapable. I think it was like avoidant part of me as well, that I didn't want to admit that like this was something that was really real. And it was something that I was really worried would affect the way that people perceive my family as well. I remember my mum telling me like when I got the diagnosis, she's like, do not tell anyone, like you'll never get a job again, because that's what she thought would happen.
Save face, right?
100%. And I was so scared. I was really worried about like being labeled with this forever and people perceiving that as being like the first thing to see me, and just feeling more different. Because I think like when I rocked up to spaces, people would immediately assume my race, my background, my gender, stuff like that. And I just didn't want people to assume like another whole part of me. It was like, oh great, another thing that makes me different. And that was incredibly difficult to reconcile at the time, when I was just trying to be a kid and just trying to have fun. And suddenly I thought that this was like a permanent part of who I was. That was incredibly difficult. But it also, there was a part of it that kind of gave me a bit of peace and a bit of answers to the things I've been experiencing. I realized that, you know, the label also came with options for support, and like I could go and like Google depression or anxiety and see like other people's stories and connect with people that were having similar experiences, not the same, but similar. And that was really healing. And that was so exciting to see that like I now had the language to communicate what I was feeling, because at the time it just felt like there was just this really difficult, like heavy blanket kind of feeling, and I would never be able to navigate it, or it was something that I would always have to live with, and it felt unbearable. And honestly, like one of the things that did lead me to my diagnosis was that it was my first suicide attempt when I was age 12, because I just felt like I was struggling with so much and there were no answers, and the only way that I could kind of escape it was to make everything stop. So it wasn't the fact that I wanted to die, I just didn't want to keep feeling a certain way. So part of receiving the diagnosis or the help or finding language was like, I realized that there are other ways out of that, and that, you know, dying isn't necessarily the only way to navigate that. So that was mixed, really mixed as an experience. But then when I started, like I was in, you know, weekly psychology sessions, and that was like, you know, okay in the hour that you would see the psychologist, but then afterwards everything else would be normal, and normal was bad at that time, and it was really difficult to navigate. And I think at the time, like finding the right psychologist is honestly so difficult. I engaged with like 4 or 5 different psychologists that, you know, had perceived different parts of myself, whether it be like they didn't understand the cultural aspects, or they didn't understand like XYZ of my interests or what was happening for me. I finally found the right one, but they would only talk about like certain diagnoses, and they were only specialized in a certain type of therapy. So that was really difficult. I didn't realize that there were more options outside of that until much later. I think, so that was age 12. Around like age 15, 16 was when I was diagnosed with eating disorders. And I do want to flag that like these diagnoses are only at the point where like someone else notices it and then gives you that label, but I was experiencing it like the whole time. I felt like kind of annoyed when I got those second diagnoses of like, I have been in these weekly psychology sessions for so long, and people had seen me like engage in like really disordered eating, and no one picked up on it, and no one questioned it. And that was, I felt, I think that label, that diagnosis came with a bit of like anger and frustration of like, wow, I really thought that this was like, I reached a point where I'd gotten help and someone would be able to give me all the answers that I needed. And then I realized like, no, actually, I need to be a lot more upfront with different parts of myself. I need to be upfront with like the right people and find the right supports, because there may be more answers that are left to be unlocked. So there was a bit of like grief of, crap, I don't just have depression and anxiety, there's like more to it. So that did open up more possibilities for me exploring who I was. So I did explore like a little bit more and realized that I had been experiencing domestic violence at the time and homelessness. So I got given a lot of language supports that a bit late down the line of when I actually needed it, but it was, you know, better late than never, I guess. But it also helped me understand like bits of things that didn't necessarily deserve diagnoses. So like understanding about my gender and my sexuality, realizing that like I can explore my experiences and get language and support and community around it. So that was very beautiful and very nice. And then later on down the line, when I particularly started working in like more mental health spaces, and was working with a lot more people that identify with mental health experiences, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I shouldn't have a favorite diagnosis, but that definitely is my favorite. I was working alongside a lot of other young people and supporting them through their experiences. It's what's called peer work. So instead of being a psychologist and like fixing people's problems, I was more so just holding space with them, having conversations, hanging out with them, and being like, oh, okay, like that's how it is for you, like similar for me. And it's just someone that understands where you're coming from because they've lived it as well. But I was working with a lot of people that had ADHD diagnoses, and they would talk about their experience. I'd be like, hey, you know, I went and did this thing and I forgot it like 50 times a day, or I'm having like 50 thoughts at once. And I'd be like, oh yeah, me too. And they're like, you should probably get that looked at. And the similarities between me and many of the people that I was working with didn't just like, it fit outside of the boxes of the labels I'd previously been given. So it wasn't depression or anxiety or eating disorders or anything like that. It was something else. And there were too many coincidences of me realizing like, oh, hey, actually like maybe I am neurodivergent, or maybe I have ADHD. So I ended up seeking a diagnosis for that. And it was a very like me going out, looking for the resources and support at the time. And I was so literate and so well versed with the navigation of the mental health system at that point, which is a privilege that I had that many people didn't have. So I was looking up like, hey, I know I need to go see a psychiatrist instead of a psychologist. I know that there's like more biological aspects to ADHD than there are like environmental aspects. Like my depression, my anxiety was a lot about my environment. And so like I knew that there were certain medications that would help me a lot more. There were kind of cultural and gender biases that came into it. So like I knew that particularly being femme presenting, being born as a female, it was really difficult to get an ADHD diagnosis. All the symptoms presented in different ways compared to diagnostic criteria. So I needed to find a professional that would help me understand all of that and could recognize that within the complexity. So I was very specific with how I sought out that help. And I ended up finding a psychiatrist that works really well with particularly culturally diverse and femme presenting people. Thank God. They were like, honestly, such an amazing human. I remember receiving like, after paying so much money for the assessment of it.
It's expensive.
Oh my gosh, it's so expensive. It's so ridiculously expensive. It's like thousands of dollars to just get an answer that gives you a label for something that you live with consistently. But the assessment report was so validating. It said like, I cried reading it. It was so, so beautiful. My psychiatrist said like, Emily definitely has ADHD, but it hasn't presented until a point like now because they've been masking so much due to their culture and due to like all these expectations around their gender. And they detailed like all this complexity and intersectionalities within my experience that had made my diagnosis so difficult to see. And it was just so meaningful. And having ADHD medication particularly is like, there are a lot of medications that I've been on for like depression, anxiety, and eating disorders that have been really up and down. And honestly, it's so difficult to navigate. But the ADHD medication has like really, really helped. There's this thing called like hyperfixation where you could like fixate on something really intensely. It can be really negative of like, I get distracted doing something and forget that I have a physical body and that I need to eat or drink. And I can hyperfixate on the wrong thing. But sometimes it's absolutely a superpower. So nowadays I can hyperfixate on the things that I choose with the medication, which is so, so meaningful. My sleep is better. My physical health is a lot better.
Yeah, wow.
I can communicate better. It's, it's so, so, so great. So favorite diagnosis by far. But then along the line, very similarly, a few years later, I was diagnosed with autism. I think that was very difficult because the other diagnoses that I picked up, they were like mental health conditions, but autism is something that like is more lumped in the disability category. And I thought like, you know, there are definitely bits of like developmental type things that people with ADHD need like support around, like learning in school and like different types of accommodations around that. But autism needs like a whole lot more. It's a whole different side of, who you are. And I think getting that diagnosis, was really a lot of like reflection and learning about who I was. The ADHD diagnosis definitely made me reflect and like see, there are these traits that I displayed when I was younger, and that's probably why. And there's like, you know, grief and anger in that of like, why didn't someone else pick that up? But then autism was like really a lot deeper because it's a lot about like all my preferences about the way that I communicate, the way that I eat and speak, like things that I think I was just termed as complex or difficult, or Emily, just get over it and stuff like that I now realize are like, it's not just like people pushing you off or dismissing you, it's ableist, like people being like discriminatory because of disability that you had. And that was really odd to look back and see like all these experiences that I had and terming them as ableist now. And stepping into the disability space was something that I felt really mixed about because I'm able-bodied. I've always like done like a lot of like sports and being like really physical, felt so privileged for all of that, and I worked alongside other people that had like very physical disabilities that prevented them from doing things that like I just didn't need to think about. And I felt like an imposter in that space as well. And doing disability advocacy and speaking about my experiences of being autistic felt so weird because I kept comparing it to all these other, like all my other peers who have faced these many other barriers their whole life. But I think it's a part of like, I reconcile within myself. I've also faced barriers. They're different. And I really try to avoid playing what I call like the trauma Olympics of like comparing your experience to someone else's and say like it's more or less.
100%.
Yeah, so it's been a journey, definitely. I don't know whether like my current collection of diagnoses is going to be final. Similar to like how my gender and sexuality has evolved over time as well. I think it's a kind of constant exploration. I think, you know, those clinical terms, diagnostic manuals will evolve as well. So I might need to change my understanding about that. But these are the things that I currently know that I have. They're not like physical ailments like a broken bone. It's not like it's completely healed. Some people like experience bits of depression and then are never depressed again. For me, like, I feel like I will always experience anxiety, always experience depression. Eating disorders are like things that come and go for me depending on my environment. And autism and ADHD are genetic things that I will always have. And I think that's what's so powerful about personal meanings of recovery is that it's me living a life that's meaningful to me regardless of the symptoms that I have, rather than like the elimination of symptoms, because I'm always going to be autistic. I'm always going to have ADHD, but I think like I can live a really meaningful and happy life regardless of that, or even because of that. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing that whole story with us. I think a lot of people listening might be able to feel heard and seen just from hearing that and opening that conversation up with their own peers. And I think it's really powerful that you've shared that. So thank you for doing that. I do want to ask though, because we are talking about like Asian nuances as well, and you've mentioned before your family, can you touch on a little bit about how your parents came into play with this, how they might have reacted and how they've been dealing with it as well? Because again, like you mentioned, it's not just your journey, it's your family's journey, it's your parents. And maybe did that uncover a lot of mental health or trauma for them that you would have realized that's impacted how you are today?
100%. I think like particularly my mum being a war refugee who didn't believe that trauma existed, I was like, that's kind of like the baseline level that we were starting at. I think the depression and anxiety, as I mentioned before, it was like difficult for them to understand that like this wasn't a shameful thing. I definitely received judgment from other people, but it wasn't as bad as they had assumed at the time. So learning about that was really difficult for them. But I think the most tied into my different experiences was like cultural experiences, especially was eating disorders, because I think in my culture that like, you know, food is like their love language. Like my mum never really said that she loved me. It was always like a plate of cut up fruit, which I think is very relatable for a lot of us. But I think like having eating disorders and rejecting the love that they were giving to me in the only way that they knew how to give it to me was very difficult for my mum to go through as well. I think that was very difficult for her to see, like me struggling with like the way that I looked, and also like me wanting to be white and me wanting to be like conforming to a certain standard of beauty. It was very hard to kind of navigate that culturally. You know, go to events where there's so much food around and you're expected to partake and then not being able to. That was very difficult, particularly with like autism as well. That's something that like I've tried to speak to them about, but I think disability again is like a whole nother category that's really hard. And like they've made leaps and bounds with understanding mental health in different parts of my diagnoses. But I think disability and like gender, sexuality and other sorts of bits, they're a little bit further for them. And so it will take a lot more time, I think, a lot more understanding. But it's something that I think they're really worried about being labeled with in a negative way. But they've really grown to see that the way that I express myself is through pride. Like I'm proud to be autistic, to be honest. Like I love my ADHD. I love sharing about it. And I'm very public about it. And I think when they've seen that, and they've seen also like if I post like publicly about it or share it in the newspaper or something like that, and then other people go and celebrate it too, that's permission giving for them to see like, oh, hey, Emily isn't going to be hated because of these things. Because that's all they're really worried about.
It's the deepest fears.
Yeah. They just want to protect me from bad things. But they're seeing that this is actually something that's good and has a lot of meaning. And it's really powerful for me to share it. So yeah, they're growing so much. And I'm so immensely proud of them. So I think like it's going to be an ongoing journey. Definitely a lot more steps to go, but they've really, I couldn't be more proud of my parents.
Definitely. And have you opened up the conversation with them about their own journeys or what they've experienced or how they might be feeling from their own past? Like you've mentioned as well, war refugees, that's a lot of trauma to hold. But obviously your mum, Asian parents a lot of the time, especially migrant parents, they go through a lot of stuff, and in their worlds of survival, mental health is probably the last thing that they would even think of.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really exist in their world to begin with. So to be faced with that and to start that conversation can be quite difficult for our parents too, also for ourselves. So my question is mainly around, have you opened up that conversation about what they've gone through, and have they opened up to share that with you too?
One of the biggest wins with my parents was when my mum started seeing the same psychologist as me.
Wow.
Which was like difficult for me because I was like, oh my gosh, this psychologist knows so much about my family. But it was also so exciting because she realized like, hey, Emily's actually getting support that they need. And now like they can see like how much I'm progressing. And now my mum wanted to see like, oh, hey, actually, I'm experiencing similar things, particularly with regards to anxiety.
Wow.
And so talking through that with a psychologist was so meaningful for her as well. And then my dad is a lot harder. He's like, honestly, one of the funniest individuals, but he doesn't really communicate verbally at all. And so his way of expressing love and his way of understanding about his own journey, my mum will like text me being like, hey, your dad's up like watching YouTube about like different types of mental health. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so nice.
Wow. That's a huge step.
It's huge. It's so exciting. And I think like having those sorts of conversations, I've had like, you know, it's hard, particularly within like domestic violence, because I think for them, like I can tell them that like it's not their fault that I'm autistic or that I have ADHD. Like they didn't do something that caused me to be this way. I think like a lot of them, they just feel like guilt and blame for certain things. But domestic violence like is a direct example of like it's intergenerational. You know, there's many examples that like they could have stopped the cycle, but they didn't at the time. And I think having conversations around that has been incredibly powerful. Those have been the ones that I'm like most proud of them, I think. Then being able to recognize that like they didn't mean to do me harm, but that doesn't mean that they didn't do me harm. And that intentions don't qualify like the outcome. And I think me expressing to them like, hey, I understand where you're coming from, and me being able to show like empathy for their side whilst like not abandoning my own was really powerful for me as well. So we've had like so many conversations around us acknowledging the fact that we were all just doing the best that we had with the time. None of us were doing great. I definitely wasn't perfect. And I think like just being able to recognize that like we now know better ways and we can apologize for what happened, but definitely move on in like better ways.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge as well, like in our prep call that we spoke about, that journey of opening up to your parents and speaking about these kinds of things was not an easy journey. And you are able to speak about it from the other end of things where things are a bit smoother now. However, I also want to acknowledge not a lot of people have that privilege of being able to open up to their parents or be in a safe environment to be able to do so. However, do you have any advice for people who would like to start having this conversation, or maybe encouraging them to have conversations with their parents if they have a safe enough space to do so, and how can they navigate that?
I think my biggest tip would be boundaries. And I don't think that that's something that we're taught. Like most of my peers that have been through similar situations to me, we have zero boundaries and we're just like taught to like, you know, listen to people and do whatever they say. Developing boundaries was honestly the first and biggest step, and was the biggest part of my parents actually meeting me halfway. Because I think if I pictured like my parents and I on different ends of a spectrum or understanding, I just kept trying to move towards their side. And every time that I did, it was just losing more and more of myself in that process. And it reached a point where like I would just feel so not me and so angry and hurt instead of sad. And it's not productive for a conversation and not good for that relationship. And I think just acknowledging that like my parents were not ready or able or willing. They didn't have the right supports, or they didn't have the right mindset at the time to meet me where I needed them to meet me. And that's okay. And acknowledging that like I removed myself completely from that situation. I moved out of home. Like I might paint this like rosy picture now, and it is rosy right now, but it was so awful for so long. I went through bouts of like completely wanting to like ameliorate myself from the situation, remove myself completely. I wanted to like go and be emancipated from my parents. I wanted to change my name entirely and remove myself from anything to do with them. I convinced myself I was adopted for a while because I just was so different from everything that they wanted me to be and from everything that I felt like they valued. And it was this very like contrast reaction. I think by removing myself, putting up boundaries that were good for my self-well-being, I could heal on my own and get to a point where I didn't need to also heal for them and recognize that they need to do their own healing, their own time. And that gave them the space and time for them to reflect, see me thrive in my own way, and then for them to actually start making progress towards meeting me. And then that gave me permission to start moving again. I think like that's the biggest thing that I can say is that it's not up to you to heal for your parents. It's not up to you to be the conversation starter. Like I definitely feel like there are bits that we can lead each other along the way. But you are not your parents' parents. You do not owe them anything around that regard. Like I just felt so guilty for my parents. And I felt so responsible for like giving them back this life that they've given me. There is an aspect to that you can be a good child and do that in different ways, but you don't necessarily have to educate them on things that they're not willing to learn about that time. Like build boundaries, focus on yourself, and give them the time and space that if they want to move towards you, when they want to, they will. Otherwise, like just focus on you, because that's honestly like I think that's the main thing. I think if I had focused on just consistently building up with my parents, we would have ended up in a really big fire. Like it would have been so catastrophic. So I think giving us both time to heal and understand ourselves before working towards the middle, that was the key thing for me. Yeah.
I think that's really powerful advice. Boundaries though, what does boundary setting look like? Because that might not be familiar for a lot of people. Walk us through what that looks like for you and what it might look like for other people too.
I think it's a lot about, there's so many different types of boundaries. One of the ones that I put with my parents was like time, topics, as well as like energy. And so I'd be really clear about like, hey, I'm not going to do this at this certain time, or like, I'm not going to talk to you about this right now, or like stuff like that. That's very clear. But the first kind of step to doing that is acknowledging within yourself, like what you're comfortable with. And boundaries can change. But for me, there are definitely things that are like, this is very off topic right now, and like holding firm to that and being really confident in who I am before I express that to someone else. And then expressing it really clearly and succinctly, like, this is what I don't want to do, or this is what I'm willing to do. And then this is what will happen if you cross that boundary. I think like there are some boundaries that for me are like kind of fluid, and like people can like toe the line, and that's more of like just like touching the boundary. But then there's like really violating and crossing it that I'm not going to be okay with. And you do need to put in like consequences for that. So I made that very clear to my parents of like, hey, you know, we've spoken about this like X number of times. If you say this to me, I'm going to end the conversation because I don't want you to talk to me that way. And like, I will make that very clear. And so they'll know that like that is a hard boundary. They will work around it. But if they cross it, like they have the information available and they know what's going to happen. I think boundaries are really hard to communicate and they're hard to set for yourself. But you do need to be clear about the consequences involved with those sorts of boundaries as well, and hold yourself accountable to that as well. It was really hard for me for a very long time to like, because I'd be like, but I can see them trying. But sometimes I need to be firm with those boundaries, and I need to be true to who I am, because I can see that like that's what's best for me. So setting consequences, communicating them clearly, and then making sure that other people like they need to respect that, because that's respecting you, that's respecting the relationship, and it's just kind of the rules in the relationship that you need to play by that will make you like so much healthier as a person. I think the key point for me that like I realized that my mom was respecting my boundaries was like, she would, instead of, you know, sending me the massive lecture out of nowhere, which is terrifying to receive, she'd be like, hey, Emily, I noticed you did this. Can we talk about it? Would you be open to hearing my perspective? Wow. And like, I received that in a text. I immediately got up and showed my partner. I'm like, look at this, like, look at this progress. Like that is healthy communication that she was never taught, but she learned because we learned together, and like, it's massive. Yeah.
And it takes years sometimes, you know, like it's not an overnight thing. No. And it takes a lot of work to slowly chip away at that. Just conscious of time too, before we wrap up, I want to ask a few more questions. The next one is, a lot of resources out there for mental health and where to seek help is, in my experience personally, I find it's quite limited for a lot of Asian Australians and Australians in general, especially when it comes to money as well. It's an expensive journey to get diagnosed with anything. Even with a mental health plan, I think speaking to a lot of friends, going through it myself recently, it's you only get so many, and then let alone there's more gap payments now that you have to make. And then you also have to date around for a psychologist because you don't know who is going to be right for you.
Yep.
And going through that process, you need to go through a few appointments already in itself.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice or resources that you can share for young Australians, Asian Australians who are listening as well, or just anyone from our audience who is listening, for where they can start the journey and where they can open the conversation for them and where they can go for resources?
There is this amazing resource called Shapes and Sounds. And it's the first one that I've seen that has like a whole list of like Asian Australian practitioners that work in mental health. And being able to meet with someone that like understands your culture kind of generally and that you can see that safety in them, that's a whole type of healing that like, yeah, you can't put a price on really. So I think like resources like that, communities like that, where you're seeing people flock together that are of a certain kind of community, that's really, really healing. So I'd say like look for resources online from people that look or identify like you, whether that be like race, whether that be gender, whether that be like economic class even, because there are lots of people sharing their stories, particularly like online and bravely, and seeing like what they actually did. You don't need to follow that strict recipe, but it can give you kind of pointers as to what to look out for. Like I recently spoke about, I released an article in The Age about like me spending $50,000 on my mental health last year. And like I detailed like all the different costs in that of like, this is how much psychologist sessions cost me and the gap fees. And like, you only get 10 free sessions free. And it's like, here are all the psychiatrist costs, here are the transportation costs, legal costs, stuff like that. Like there are many other people that are sharing stories that are similar to that, and just being aware of kind of what's available, of what you should kind of walk into, and then reaching out to those people and asking for help and say like, hey, do you have any tips and tricks? I think that's really, really powerful, because the people that know it best are the people that have walked that journey. And in my experience, there are so many people that have experienced braving a storm and are very willing to come back and walk through that storm again with someone else, because we don't want other people to experience the crap that we went through. We want to create a better society where people actually understand the barriers that are in place. So do your research, but then do reach out to people that will understand, because there's not like one way to heal from mental health. There's so many options available. There's so many people that are willing to help you.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that as well. I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, and it's a bit more of a loaded question, but I do want to put out, like, what do you think the government or organisations in Australia can do better for young Australians, young Asian Australians, everyone out there in general looking for more mental health resources, or just supporting communities better, especially those in lower socioeconomic areas, those who might not even know where to start the conversation or where to go for that too?
I'll do a two-part answer to this. The first one's much more like engagement kind of processes. There's this engagement continuum where on one end it's kind of like the government or like big like deciding bodies just going and telling people information, which is where a lot of health information is at the moment. It's just them like saying like, hey, this is happening, and then expecting us to kind of conform to their needs. And then when you move a little bit up the spectrum, it's a bit like they kind of hold the mic out to us for a little bit and hear what we're experiencing, but then they take it away and they do whatever they want with it. And then as you move up to the other end, you get these things like co-design. And that's a term that's thrown around at the moment, but it's more about like engaging with people in every step of like not just the development of a process, but also the design from the outright set, and like also the evaluation of it. But I think that the last step is co-production, and that's really about like giving it over to the community and letting us lead that. And I think that that's where you get so many nuances that come out of it, because we know our experiences best. We know what will help us best. And if we can group together, share our experiences, and actually lead that and design it ourselves and decide the final outcome, that's massive. So I think like there's a lot of power sharing that's done in that can be done in like very logistical ways of actually co-producing things with diverse people who understand the complexities and the struggles. But on an individual level, I think that there's so much that like people can do, whether it be like a big decision maker, someone in parliament, or it's just someone that's in the community or the barista down the street. I think like I've kind of broken it into like a 3-step kind of process. The first one is to learn about yourself. Everyone has mental health. not everyone has mental health challenges. Obviously, it's like different for everyone, but I think everyone has mental health and everyone has different types of privilege as well, whether that be race, whether that be ability or education or employment. Just learning about yourself and checking yourself about your privilege, be able to see like where you're privileged in and where you're also oppressed in, where you're lucky and where you're not. That's so powerful, and be able to understand like, hey, this is actually, I'm really aware of everything that I have going on to me. Because most people, they're not aware of it because they're just given it and they think everyone else is going through the same. And then the next step is to learn about other people. So to have those compassionate conversations, but it's important to do step one first, because a lot of us like leak our kind of biases over into other people's experiences. And my experience of mental health, even though we might share a lot of stuff, will be completely different to yours. So in order to understand you, I need to understand myself first and really see where my experience ends and see where yours starts. So that's the second step. But I think the third step is around like speaking up for other people, particularly people who like don't want to speak up or aren't ready to speak up or don't have the support, and then showing up with them when they're ready to speak up. So, and I think like showing up with them doesn't mean necessarily standing alongside them. It can look like standing behind them as well. And I think a lot of people do need to step back at the moment. A lot of people are taking up space in certain areas or like of leadership, or say like boards of companies, or just bits of speaking that need to step back for more people to come forward. And I think there are so many young people, particularly like younger people, that are so outspoken and so well versed with like their own experiences, that I think like we just don't have the space to come forward a lot of time because it's so overpopulated. So I think speaking up, showing up and stepping back, massive. And I think that there needs to be a lot more of that.
I agree. Like a lot of the younger generation is so powerful right now. They just need to be given the space to be able to do so, and they are fighting for that. And I think that's really wonderful. Just to wrap things up too, what does the future of what you're doing look like for you? What's coming up in the next few years?
There's so much stuff that's changing in my life generally, and particularly within mental health. Like over the past, say 2 years in just Victoria alone, like there's been so many different progresses forward with mental health and the reform and different policy bits, and it's so reliant on one person or one report being released, and then everything else changes and shifts. And I kind of love that. I love how like agile and flexible it is. So I can't have a clear idea of where things are going to go. And I think particularly with like technology, my interest in that as well, and how much that affects our mental health, there are so many things that are developing on like a day-by-day basis that I can't really know. I know that I will always want to be in spaces where I'm hearing people's stories and giving them the permission and space and resources for them to speak for themselves, and embed that in whatever big thing is going to come next. So whether that be like building relationships between the current power holders and the people that don't have power, and putting them up there and giving them the space to talk for themselves, I think like that's the majority of what my work's going to look like. But the settings, the exact details of that, that's going to change dramatically over the next couple of years, or even the next like 6 months. I love this work. I love connecting with people, and feeling like there's actually like hope for change.
Yeah, and all of the work that you're doing is incredible. And again, it's creating such an impact for so many generations to come. If people are interested in connecting with you, where can they find you?
If you Google Emily Unity, my name should come up. LinkedIn is usually, I'm really bad at social media, so I can only stick to one platform, and I've been kind of like peer pressured into using LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, but I also have a website, www.emilyunity.com, so you can message me there as well. I'm really like, I just love connecting with people that have similar experiences or are passionate about any of this. And if there's anything I can do to possibly help or just have a chat, like that's, honestly, I'd love it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and being so vulnerable with your story and sharing so much of your work and what you do. Again, thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me. Honestly, I love talking about this, and it's so nice to talk to peers about it as well.
100%.
Thanks so much for tuning in. A lot of work and effort goes into Level Asian with a whole team behind the scenes. While we aren't looking for anyone to pay for this content, what helps the podcast grow, reach more people, and benefit more Asians around the world is if you could leave a 5-star review if you're on Spotify, Apple, Google, or any other audio platforms. And leave us a like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Catch you on the next episode.